Chapter 1. Introduction. Who was Queen Victoria and why is she so important to this day? When we talk about the 19th century, there is hardly a figure who is as strongly associated with this era as Queen Victoria. Today, her name stands not only for a monarch, but for an entire age, the Victorian Age. Victoria reigned from 1837 to 1901, a full 63 years, longer than almost any other monarch in British history. Only her great-great-granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II, surpassed her reign. During this long time, Britain has undergone an incredible transformation. From a predominantly agrarian country, it has developed into the world's leading industrial nation and the heart of a global empire about which it was said, "The sun never sets." Symbol of an era. Victoria was not only a queen in the political sense, but a symbol. Her reign took place at a time of enormous change, and she herself became the face of this era. Industrialization. Steamships, railways, telegraphy, and factories changed the lives of millions of people. Scientific advances. Researchers such as Charles Darwin or Michael Faraday questioned old world views. Cultural flourishing. Literary greats such as Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, and Oscar Wilde shaped the art and thought of their time. Social change. New classes emerged, the women's movement began, and social reforms took hold. Victoria stood, often rather involuntarily, as a moral model above all these developments. Many saw her as the embodiment of order, family, and a sense of duty. A queen and her family. Another reason for her importance was her family. Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, had 9 children, who were married into the royal houses all over Europe. As a result, Victoria became the grandmother of Europe, a designation that underlines not only her family connections, but also her political influence. Many rulers of the early 20th century, including the German Emperor Wilhelm II, were their grandchildren. The family became a model for the bourgeois ideal of the time, a life that was characterized by loyalty, diligence, and morality. This image helped the monarchy maintain its legitimacy in a time of political upheaval. Monarchy in transition. When Victoria ascended the throne, Britain was already a constitutional monarchy, with real power in the hands of Parliament. But the monarch still had influence, especially through her personality, her relationships with prime ministers, and her role as a moral authority. In the course of her reign, the role of the crown continued to change. From active intervention in politics and government to a more representative function. From the power of the scepter to the power of symbols. This change was crucial to preserving the monarchy in a modern, increasingly democratic world. An era full of contradictions. The Victorian era was not an easy heyday. It was also full of contradictions. On the one hand, progress, wealth, culture, expansion. On the other hand, poverty, child labor, exploitation in factories and colonies. Queen Victoria self-embodied this contradiction. She lived in great wealth, but at the same time was known for her personal modesty. She embodied stability, but her reign was full of crises, wars, and changes. Why it is still important today. Victoria left behind a legacy that goes far beyond her own time. The image of the monarchy. It formed the model of the modern monarchy that still applies in Britain today, a representative institution that stands above politics. The empire. Under her rule, the British Empire reached its greatest extent. She herself was crowned Empress of India in 1876. The Victorian heritage. Architecture, literature, morals, even furniture styles, all of this still bears her name today. A historical standard. Her reign is an era by which others can be measured. The beginning of a great story. Queen Victoria was therefore much more than just a ruler. She was the face of an era that shaped Europe and the world. Their lives tell us not only of coronations and politics, but of love, grief, family, power, and a sense of duty. This video, this diary of history, will retrace the journey through her life and time, from the inconspicuous princess who surprisingly became queen to the powerful Grand Mother of Europe, whose death in 1901 marked the final farewell to the 19th century. Chapter 2: Childhood and Youth, from Princess to Heir to Throne. When we look at Queen Victoria's life, her later splendor seems almost self-evident. But her path to the crown was by no means predetermined. Her childhood was marked by insecurity, strict upbringing, and a close family environment that both shaped and burdened her. Birth of a Princess. Victoria was born on May 24, 1819, in Kensington Palace in London. Her full name was Alexandrina Victoria of Kent. Her father was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, the fourth son of King George III. Her mother was Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a German princess and sister of Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, who later became King of Belgium. At the time of her birth, no one was sure if this little girl would ever become queen. The British throne was in a complicated situation at the time. King George III was old and mentally ill, his sons had hardly any legitimate descendants, and the succession to the throne was uncertain. An unexpected place in the line of succession to the throne. Fate changed quickly. Victoria's father died only a few months after her birth, and soon after several other possible heirs to the throne died as well. So the little princess moved closer to the throne step by step. Over time, it became clear that if the reigning king, William IV, died without legitimate children, Alexandrina Victoria would become queen. This circumstance shaped her childhood. Early on, there was an enormous weight on the shoulders of the little girl, even if they tried to keep her away from this fact at first. The strict upbringing, the Kensington system. Victoria's childhood was anything but carefree. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her confidant, Sir John Conroy, developed a strict educational system that later became known as the Kensington system. This system was designed to control the girl and shield her from external influences. Victoria was rarely allowed to leave the house unaccompanied. She had to stay constantly in the company of her mother or governesses. She was hardly allowed to make friends with her peers. Every aspect of their everyday life was closely monitored. The intention behind this was clear. Conroy hoped to exercise power over the young princess and her mother if Victoria should one day become queen. But the system also had side effects. It made Victoria strong-willed, independent, and determined. Even as a child, she developed a strong awareness that she had to defend herself against control and manipulation. Education and character. Despite the strict upbringing, Victoria received a solid education. Governesses taught them languages, history, literature, and music. In addition to English, she was fluent in German and French. From an early age, she showed a pronounced curiosity and a strong character. Contemporary witnesses described her as lively, sometimes stubborn, but also dutiful. In her diaries, which she kept from the age of 13, you can already feel her sense of responsibility and her need for self-determination. These diaries, which Victoria wrote almost daily throughout her life, are still an invaluable source for historians today. First encounters with fate. A famous moment in Victoria's youth was the day she was first made aware that she was likely to become queen. According to legend, she was shown a family tree, and the young girl is said to have said, "I want to be good." This sentence may sound simple, but it illustrates how seriously the young princess felt the responsibility that weighed on her even in her youth. Relationship with her mother. The relationship with her mother was complicated. On the one hand, Victoria loved her mother. On the other hand, she rejected the tight corset of upbringing. She especially loathed Sir John Conroy. She saw him as a man trying to control her life. These tensions meant that once Victoria became queen, she was determined to break away from Conroy and her mother's influence. The youth years. Despite all the severity, Victoria also experienced moments of joy. She loved to draw, ride, and dance.
She was musically gifted and had a strong interest in art and theater. Her uncle, Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, the later King of Belgium, was of particular importance. He was a kind of father figure and mentor to Victoria. He supported her emotionally and also subtly prepared her for her future role. The way to the Queen. As Victoria grew older, the situation came to a head. King William IV had no legitimate children. It was clear that as soon as he died, the young princess, just 18 years old, would become Queen of the United Kingdom. This prospect was unsettling to many. Was such a young girl capable of leading a powerful empire? But contemporary witnesses report that Victoria showed a strong self-confidence at a young age and made it clear that she did not want to be just a puppet of her mother or Conroy's. Conclusion. From princess to beacon of hope. Victoria's childhood and youth were thus shaped by two poles. On the one hand, narrowness, control, and strict upbringing. On the other hand, self-confidence, education, and determination. This combination shaped her into a personality who was willing to take on immense responsibility at a young age. On June 20, 1837, shortly after her 18th birthday, King William IV died, and Alexandrina Victoria became Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. The world looked eagerly at the young woman, who now held the fate of a world empire in her hands.
Chapter 3. The Accession to the Throne in 1837. A young queen takes over an empire. On the morning of June 20, 1837, the life of the young Alexandrina Victoria changed abruptly. The king, William IV, had died in the early hours. Before sunrise, envoys rushed to Kensington Palace to inform the 18-year-old princess she was now Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The first hours as queen. The moment Victoria was woken up is legendary. A messenger brought the news that the king was dead. Victoria, in a white nightgown, received the news with a calmness and dignity that surprised many. She immediately insisted that she no longer be called Drina or Alexandrina, but Victoria, a clear signal that she took her new role seriously. Her first audience as queen took place at Kensington Palace. Ministers and court officials were impressed by the seriousness and dignity of the young woman. One of them later wrote, "She spoke so decisively that we all knew immediately. She will govern and not be governed." A young girl on the throne. The fact that an 18-year-old suddenly became the ruler of a world empire came as a surprise to many, and also a reason for skepticism. Women had sat on the British throne before, but Victoria was still so young, inexperienced, and fresh from a childhood marked by isolation. Her mother and Sir John Conroy had hoped to continue to exert influence over her, but Victoria immediately showed that she was her own wife. She distanced herself from Conroy and deprived him of all power. She insisted on making her own decisions. She no longer wanted to submit to her mother's control. This self-confident step right at the beginning of her reign was decisive for her later reputation. The crowning glory. On June 28, 1838, a year after her accession to the throne, the ceremonial coronation took place in Westminster Abbey. Over 400,000 people came to London to catch a glimpse of the young queen. The streets were decorated. There was a folk festival. The ceremony was magnificent, if chaotic in some parts. The young queen mastered it with grace. Victoria herself later wrote in her diary that this day had been the proudest of my life. First challenges. But the splendor of the coronation could not hide the fact that she faced enormous challenges. 1. Political uncertainty. The United Kingdom was in a state of flux. The reform laws of the 1830s had expanded the right to vote and changed the political landscape. The power of the monarchy had shrunk, the importance of Parliament had grown. 2. Expectations of the Queen. The people expected Victoria to be a moral role model. At the same time, she should look young, modern, and approachable. 3. Court intrigue. Many nobles distrusted her, others tried to influence her. Her relationship with her mother in particular remained tense. The bedchamber crisis, an early political drama.
As early as 1839, there was a crisis that tested Victoria's position, the so-called bedchamber crisis. When Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, a close confidant of Victoria, resigned, the Conservative Robert Peel was to take over the government. Peel demanded that Victoria replace some of her ladies-in-waiting, close confidants of the Queen, as they were too politically connected to the Whigs. Victoria strictly refused. For her, this was not only a political question, but a very personal one. She didn't want to lose her friends. Peel withdrew and Melbourne remained Prime Minister. This conflict showed two things. Victoria was ready to assert her power. At the same time, her political inexperience was revealed as she did not realize how much the monarchy depended on neutrality. Popularity among the people. Despite such crises, Victoria quickly gained popularity. The people saw in her a fresh, young queen who stood out from the lavish and often scandalous lifestyle of her predecessors. Their performances were characterized by modesty and dignity. She showed interest in the everyday life of her subjects. She embodied a new morality that would soon become known as Victorian. Especially in the first few years, her charm played an important role in re-anchoring the monarchy in a changing society. Personal development. In those early years, Victoria also had to learn to find herself in her role. She regularly wrote in her diary, reflected on politics and her feelings. She began to hold Prime Minister Melbourne in high esteem. He became a kind of father figure to her. She discovered that she could not only be a representative figure, but actively exert influence, albeit within the boundaries of the constitutional monarchy. A new chapter begins. Victoria's accession to the throne marked the beginning of a new chapter in British history. A new generation had ascended the throne. The monarchy was no longer an absolutist center of power, but developed into a moral and representative institution. Victoria herself grew from an inexperienced young woman to a queen who would soon become one of the most powerful and well-known personalities of her time. Result: the years 1837 to 1839 were marked by youth, uncertainty, but also determination. Victoria showed that she was not the puppet of her mother or the politicians. She took over an empire in transition and became the driving force of this change herself. But her life was soon to change dramatically again when she met the man who was to become her partner, advisor, and great love, Prince Albert.
Chapter 4. Marriage to Prince Albert. Love, family, and political influence. When you talk about Queen Victoria, you can't get past one name, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was not only her husband, but also her closest advisor, father of her 9 children, and the person who had the strongest influence on her life. The first encounter. Victoria and Albert were cousins. Both came from the house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a German dynasty with close ties to Great Britain. They first met in 1836, when Albert and his brother Ernest visited London. At that time, Victoria was still a princess, but already heir to the throne. In her diary, she wrote of Albert, "He is so lovely, so gentle, and I already love him very much." But a marriage had not yet been decided at that time. The decision for Albert. After Victoria became queen in 1837, the question of marriage arose. For a young monarch, it was not only a private decision, but above all a political one. Many candidates were proposed to her, but Victoria insisted that she wanted to marry for love. In the end, she chose Albert. In 1839, he came back to England, and Victoria was convinced, "This is the man of my life." Since she was queen, she had to officially propose. On October 15, 1839, she wrote in her diary, "It was the happiest, brightest moment of my life." The wedding. On February 10, 1840, Victoria and Albert were married in St. James's Palace Chapel in London. The wedding was a national event and was enthusiastically received by the population. Victoria wore a white dress, a tradition that continues to have an effect today, as she popularized the custom of white wedding dresses. The couple seemed happy, in love, and youthful. The marriage was to turn out to be deep and meaningful, both privately and politically. Love and partnership. Victoria and Albert had a very close relationship.
Their numerous letters and diary entries show that they were really in love. Albert was not only a husband to Victoria, but also a confidant. She often called him her angel or my beloved. She relied heavily on his advice, sometimes so much so that critics accused him of having too much influence. But their relationship was not always without tension. Victoria could be impulsive. Albert was dutiful and sometimes cold. But overall, they were united by a deep affection. A big family. Victoria and Albert had a total of 9 children. Victoria, Princess Royal. Albert Edward, later King Edward VII. Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, Beatrice. These children were skillfully married into the royal houses of Europe, which later made Victoria known as the Grandmother of Europe. Many of the great rulers of the early 20th century, including the German Emperor Wilhelm II, were her grandsons. Albert's influence on politics. Although he was officially only prince consort, Albert had great influence on politics and government business. He worked closely with ministers, especially on foreign policy issues. He advocated social reforms, including improvements in education and industry. He promoted science and technology, was an admirer of modern developments. A highlight of his work was the organization of the Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace in London, a gigantic World's Fair that symbolized the progress of the Victorian era. Tensions at court. Not everyone was enthusiastic about Albert's influence. Some politicians accused him of interfering in things that he was not entitled to, as a foreigner. There was also criticism from the public, especially in the first few years. It was only gradually that he gained respect, through his hard work, his integrity, and his loyalty to Britain. Albert's character. Albert was serious, hard-working, and morally strict. He was the opposite of lavish princely figures. He loved science, order, and the fulfillment of duty. These qualities made him a stabilizing factor for Victoria. While she was emotional and sometimes boisterous, he brought calm and rationality to the relationship. Tragedy and loss. But the marriage was not to last. On December 14, 1861, Albert died of typhus at the age of only 42. As it was believed at the time, possibly also of a chronic disease. For Victoria, this was the biggest shock of her life. She fell into deep mourning, withdrew from the public eye for years, and wore black clothes until her death. The loss of Albert was not only a personal, but also a political one. Victoria left many tasks to her ministers and was criticized as an invisible queen. Conclusion: a formative love. The marriage between Victoria and Albert was one of the most famous royal partnerships in history. It showed that monarchs could also marry out of genuine love. It made the family the moral model of an entire era. Albert's influence helped shape the Victorian era, through progress, reforms, and cultural achievements. For Victoria, Albert was more than a husband. He was her anchor, her partner, and the great love of her life. His early death left a void that she could never overcome.
Chapter 5. The Victorian Age. Industrialization, Science, and Social Change. When we talk about the Victorian Age, we mean more than just Queen Victoria's reign. It is synonymous with an era of rapid change, full of progress, but also full of contradictions. Between 1837 and 1901, the face of Britain, and with it the world, changed more profoundly than ever before. Industrialization. Great Britain as the workshop of the world. At the heart of the Victorian era was the Industrial Revolution, which had already begun in Britain at the end of the 18th century, but was now reaching its peak. Railways crisscrossed the country, connecting cities and regions. Journeys that used to take days were now possible in hours. Steamships shortened travel times across oceans and made trade global. Factories shaped the cities, from the textile industry to steel production. Coal and iron became the engines of the economy. Britain exported not only goods, but also technology. Engines from Manchester, ships from Liverpool, and locomotives from Birmingham went all over the world.
Thus, the country became the workshop of the world, the center of global trade and industrial innovation. Scientific and technical advances. The 19th century was also a time of revolutionary discoveries. Natural sciences. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, a work that radically changed the ideas of creation and nature. Physics and chemistry. Michael Faraday discovered principles of electricity and magnetism, the basis of modern technology. Medicine. Advances in hygiene and surgery reduced mortality, vaccination spread. Communication. The telegraph made it possible to transmit messages in minutes, a huge leap in a time that previously took weeks or months. Albert himself strongly supported science and technology, especially through the Great Exhibition of 1851. This World's Fair at the Crystal Palace was a showcase for the most modern inventions of the time and a symbol of British self-confidence. Societal changes. Industrialization brought not only wealth, but also enormous social upheavals. Urbanization. Millions of people moved from the countryside to the cities. London grew rapidly and became the largest city in the world. New industrial centers were created, but also slums with catastrophic living conditions. Social contrasts. The upper middle class, entrepreneurs, industrialists, bankers benefited enormously. Workers and children toiled in factories under the harshest conditions. Slums, disease, and hunger shaped the lives of many. These contradictions led to demands for reforms. Writers such as Charles Dickens drew attention to the grievances with novels such as Oliver Twist. Women's role. The Victorian ideal placed the woman at the center of the home, family, and morality. But it was precisely in the 19th century that the first women's movement began. Demands for education and political rights were raised. Pioneers like Florence Nightingale changed society and the professional world. Religion and morality. The Victorian era was characterized by a strong sense of morality. A sense of duty, decency, family were the focus. Religious values, especially in Protestantism, shaped thinking. At the same time, hypocrisy and double standards were criticized. Often strict values were represented to the outside world, while other rules secretly applied. Victoria and Albert themselves served as role models, a faithful couple, hard-working, pious, and family-oriented. This image strengthened the legitimacy of the monarchy. Politics in transition. During her time in office, the political landscape also changed. The right to vote was gradually extended. Reform Acts 1832, 1867, and 1884. New party structures developed, the Conservatives under Disraeli and the Liberals under Gladstone. Parliament continued to gain power, and the monarchy became more representative. Victoria herself played a role in the background by maintaining close contact with her prime ministers. Disraeli in particular won her affection, while she often found Gladstone too strict and instructive. The British Empire, expansion, and Pax Britannica. Under Victoria, the British Empire reached its greatest extent. India officially became part of the empire in 1858, after the dissolution of the East India Company. In 1876, Victoria was crowned Empress of India. Colonies in Africa, Asia, and Australia were expanded. The Royal Navy secured world trade and made Great Britain the dominant maritime power. There was talk of the Pax Britannica, a worldwide peace that seemed to be guaranteed by the power of the British Empire, even if it was based on colonial oppression. Culture and literature. The Victorian era was also a cultural heyday. Literature. In addition to Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Thomas Hardy, and Oscar Wilde shaped the era. Theater became popular and attracted broad strata. Architecture. The neo-Gothic style dominated, visible in the construction of the Palace of Westminster. Handicrafts. Furniture and design of the Victorian style are still known today. Contradictions of the age. Despite all its successes, the era was full of tensions. Progress and poverty existed side by side. Morality and hypocrisy shaped society. Pride in the empire went hand in hand with brutal colonial policies. This is what makes the Victorian era so fascinating to this day. It was an era of extremes in which the modern world emerged. Conclusion: an age in the name of Victoria. The Victorian era was an era that meant far more than the life story of a queen. It was a time when Britain became the center of the world, in which technology, science, culture, and society were rethought. Victoria herself was a symbol and figure of identification. She embodied stability and morality in a world of upheaval, and that is exactly why the era was named after her.
Chapter 6. Politics and Prime Ministers. Relations with Peel, Disraeli, and Gladstone. Queen Victoria was a constitutional monarch and thus limited in her political power, but she was by no means powerless. Their personalities, likes and dislikes, shaped relations with the prime ministers of their time. Some she admired, others she rejected, and this dynamic had a decisive influence on the political life of the Victorian era. Robert Peel, respect through conflict. Robert Peel was one of the first major prime ministers Victoria worked with. However, their relationship got off to a bumpy start. The bedchamber crisis. As early as 1839, the bedchamber crisis occurred. Peel, a conservative politician, was to take over the government and demanded that Victoria exchange some of her ladies-in-waiting, as they were politically linked to the Whigs. Victoria refused. To her, these ladies were not just employees, but close friends. Peel refrained from forming a government, and the Whigs remained in power. This episode showed that Victoria was still politically inexperienced at the time and did not understand the role of the monarchy as a nonpartisan institution. Growing collaboration. Later, however, especially during Peel's second term, 1841 to 1846, mutual respect developed. Peel showed integrity and a willingness to reform, for example by abolishing the Corn Laws, which liberalized trade and made bread more affordable. Victoria learned that a monarch had to work in the background, advising, supporting, but not dominating. Peel, on the other hand, gained recognition for his clever, cautious manner. Benjamin Disraeli, charmer and favorite. If there was one prime minister Victoria particularly liked, it was Benjamin Disraeli, the leader of the Conservatives. Disraeli's personality. Disraeli was charismatic, witty, and knew how to win people over, especially the Queen. He flattered her, spoke to her respectfully, and treated her as a partner, not just a symbol. He affectionately called her the greatest woman in the world, and Victoria enthusiastically wrote in her journal how pleasant she found working with him. Political successes. Under Disraeli, the empire experienced a new heyday. In 1875, Great Britain bought Egypt's Suez Canal share, a decisive step in controlling trade with India. In 1876, Victoria was officially crowned Empress of India, a title she bore with great pride. Disraeli knew how to integrate the monarchy into imperial politics and to stage Victoria herself. A relationship of affection. For Victoria, Disraeli was not only a politician, but also a friend. She felt understood by him, almost adored. This close relationship led to her preferring the Conservative Party for a long time. William Gladstone, dutiful man and difficult partner. Victoria's relationship with William Gladstone, the leader of the Liberals, was quite different. Gladstone's character. Gladstone was highly intelligent, morally serious, and strictly religious. He saw politics as a mission to improve the world, with a sense of duty and principles. But it was precisely these qualities that made him difficult for Victoria to bear. She found him instructive and cold. In letters and diaries, she referred to him as the man who talks to me as if I were a public meeting. Political differences. Gladstone's policies emphasized social reforms and domestic issues.
He campaigned for education, trade unions, and the extension of the right to vote. In foreign policy, he was more cautious, less imperialist than Disraeli. Victoria, who was proud of the empire, saw weakness in it. A difficult cooperation. The cooperation was marked by tensions. Victoria never really liked Gladstone, and Gladstone himself had a hard time winning her affection. Nevertheless, she respected his abilities, albeit reluctantly. The balancing act of the monarchy. The relations with Peel, Disraeli, and Gladstone exemplify how the role of the monarchy developed in the 19th century. Under Peel, Victoria learned restraint and the importance of political neutrality. With Disraeli, she enjoyed the proximity to the government and the glamour of the empire. With Gladstone, she had to realize that personal dislike could not prevent them from working together. In the end, the monarchy increasingly became an institution that stood above the parties, representative, moral, symbolic. Victoria was part of this change, even if she was reluctant to accept it at first. Personal feelings and political weight. It is remarkable how strongly Victoria's personal sympathies and dislikes influenced her view of politics. Her enthusiasm for Disraeli led to a close bond with the Conservatives. Their rejection of Gladstone made cooperation difficult, even though he was one of the most important prime ministers of his time. This shows that even in a constitutional monarchy, the relationship between monarch and prime minister played a role, although more subtly than would have been the case in absolutism. Result: Victoria had to deal with over a dozen prime ministers over the course of her long reign, but Peel, Disraeli, and Gladstone were the most important. Peel taught her respect and understanding of constitutional monarchy. Disraeli gave her admiration and made her Empress of India. Gladstone was their most uncomfortable partner, but at the same time a guarantee of reforms. Together, these relationships show how Victoria worked as queen in a system that was becoming increasingly democratized, and how her personality nevertheless exerted political influence.
Chapter 7. The Empire Grows. India, Colonies, and the Empress of India. The Victorian era was not only characterized by industrialization and social changes, but above all by the expansion of the British Empire. Under Queen Victoria, Great Britain achieved an abundance of power that was unparalleled worldwide. Her empire spanned continents, millions of people were under British rule, and at the center of this vast network was the monarch herself, who was crowned Empress of India in 1876. The basics of expansion. Even before Victoria's reign, the empire had grown strongly. North America, parts of the Caribbean, and colonies in Asia formed the basis. But in the 19th century, the expansion took on a new dimension. Industrialization provided the means: steamships, railways, telegraphs, and a powerful fleet. Global trade demanded safe routes and bases. National pride and the idea of the civilizing mission served as justification for conquest. Victoria herself never traveled beyond the Channel, but she became the symbol of this global empire. India, the jewel of the crown. Early reign of the East India Company. Since the 18th century, the British East India Company controlled large parts of India. It was a trading company, military power, and administration at the same time. But their rule was characterized by exploitation and mismanagement, which caused increasing tensions. The Sepoy Uprising of 1857. In 1857, there was the largest uprising against British rule in India, the so-called Sepoy Rebellion or Indian Rebellion. Indian soldiers, sepoys, who were in the service of the company, rebelled against their British officers. The uprising spread rapidly, accompanied by violence and cruelty on both sides. After months of fighting, British troops crushed the uprising, brutally and with thousands of deaths. The uprising shook the empire deeply and led to a decisive change. The crown takes over. In 1858, the East India Company was disbanded, and India officially became a colony of the British Crown. A viceroy ruled in the name of the Queen. This marked the beginning of the direct colonial rule that shaped India for almost 90 years. Victoria as Empress of India. In 1876, Prime Minister Disraeli awarded Victoria the title Empress of India. For Victoria, this was a highlight of her life. She felt honored and saw it as a sign of the greatness of her empire. Symbolically, the title underlined the central importance of India for the empire, economically, politically, and culturally. At the same time, it reflected the pride with which the British looked at their empire and the conviction that they ruled the world. Africa, the scramble for Africa. In addition to India, Africa also came into focus in the late 19th century. Great Britain founded colonies in South Africa, Egypt, Sudan, and on the West African coast. The construction of the Suez Canal, 1869, made Egypt strategically indispensable, as it drastically shortened the route to India. In 1875, Disraeli bought British shares in the canal, a master's move that secured control of London. In South Africa, the conflicts with the Boers and Zulus led to bloody wars that shaped the image of the empire. This race for Africa later became known as the Scramble for Africa, and Britain played a leading role in it. Colonies all over the world. The empire was not limited to India and Africa. Under Victoria, it grew globally. Canada received extensive self-government in 1867, but remained part of the empire. Australia and New Zealand became important settlement colonies. Caribbean and Pacific islands served as trading bases. Hong Kong came into British possession in 1842 after the First Opium War and became a central trading center. The saying, "the realm where the sun never sets," was no exaggeration. At any given time, somewhere in the world, British territory was in daylight. The Pax Britannica. The 19th century is often considered a time of Pax Britannica, a relative world peace made possible by the dominance of the British Empire. The Royal Navy was the strongest fleet in the world. Trade routes were secured. International conflicts often remained limited because British power worked in the background. For many contemporaries, it seemed as if the British Empire was unshakable, an empire for eternity. Contradictions of colonial rule. But this splendor had its downsides. Exploitation. Colonies provided raw materials and markets, while the population often remained poor. Oppression. Local cultures and structures were suppressed or marginalized. Racism. The empire justified itself with the idea of the superiority of the white race and the alleged mission to civilize other peoples. Resistance. Again and again, there were uprisings which were brutally suppressed. For many Britons, the empire was a symbol of pride, but for many colonized people, it was a symbol of oppression. Victoria and the empire. How did Victoria herself feel about the empire? She was proud of the greatness of her empire. The title Empress of India filled her with joy. She maintained close contacts with Indian servants, especially Abdul Karim, her munshi, teacher, who taught her Hindi, much to the displeasure of the court. She showed interest in the cultures of her colonies, even if she supported the colonial system at the same time. Her personal influence on colonial policy was limited, but as a symbol of the empire, she played a central role. Significance of the empire for Great Britain. The empire shaped the 19th century in several ways. Economically, it supplied raw materials such as cotton, tea, sugar, and gold. Politically, it made Britain the leading world power. Culturally, it strengthened the self-confidence, almost the chauvinism of British society. At the same time, it sowed the seeds for later conflicts, both in the colonies and internationally. Conclusion: Empress of a world empire. Under Queen Victoria, the British Empire reached its greatest expansion and influence. India became the centerpiece,
Africa the new field of imperial expansion. Colonies on all continents combined to form an empire that was seemingly invincible. Victoria herself became the symbolic figure of this empire, as queen, empress, and moral leader. For her subjects, she was the personification of stability and power, but for many colonized people, she was the face of foreign rule. The empire shaped not only Victoria's rule, but the entire 19th century, and its consequences continue to this day.
Chapter 8: Cultural Change, Art, Literature, Morals. The Victorian era was not only a century of technological progress and imperial expansion, but also an era of profound cultural changes. Art, literature, music, and architecture developed in a field of tension between tradition and modernity, while new moral concepts shaped society. These cultural currents made the 19th century a time that still resonates in our image of Britain today. Literature, mirror of society. Literature was one of the most important forms of expression of the Victorian era. Writers used novels, poems, and essays to address social issues and shed light on people's everyday lives. Charles Dickens was one of the most popular authors of his time. In works such as Oliver Twist, 1838, David Copperfield, 1850, or Bleak House, 1853, he depicted the life of the poor, child labor, corruption, and social grievances, always combined with gripping stories. Dickens made social problems visible and thus contributed to the public discussion. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, created novels such as Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, which remain classics to this day. They combined romantic passion with psychological depth and focused on female characters striving for self-determination. In his works, Thomas Hardy described the changes in rural life due to industrialization and the conflicts between tradition and modernity. Oscar Wilde, a late representative of the era, was known for his sharp wit and satirical criticism of Victorian morality and hypocrisy, for example in The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1890. Victorian literature was as diverse as society itself. It showed poverty and glamour, morality and hypocrisy, progress and despair. Art and architecture. Painting. Painting in the Victorian era was strongly influenced by Romanticism and Realism. The Pre-Raphaelites, a group of artists around Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and William Holman Hunt, sought a return to true art, inspired by the Pre-Raphael era. Her works were richly detailed, colorful, and often full of symbolism. At the same time, currents developed that depicted everyday life and social reality. Images of factory workers, port cities, or domestic scenes. Architecture. The architecture of this period is still formative today. The Neo-Gothic style became the dominant architectural style. The reconstruction of the Palace of Westminster after the fire of 1834 with the iconic Big Ben is the most famous example. Churches, universities, and town halls in the Neo-Gothic style were intended to express a connection between tradition, religion, and progress. At the same time, magnificent railway stations, museums, and industrial buildings were built that reflected the self-confidence of the age. Design. The Victorian design was opulent. Furniture, wallpaper, and fashion were richly decorated. However, William Morris and the arts and crafts movement tried to reintroduce more simplicity and craftsmanship. Music and theater. Opera and classical music were of great importance during this time. Composers such as Arthur Sullivan created the famous Savoy operas together with W.S. Gilbert, including The Mikado and HMS Pinafore. The theater was a popular pleasure for all classes, from humorous comedies to serious dramas. In the salons of the bourgeoisie, piano music and house concerts played a central role, especially for women. Music and theater served not only for entertainment, but also for moral education, a reflection of the Victorian idea of culture as an educational force. Moral concepts, the Victorian ideal.
The Victorian era is still famous for its morals and is often associated with strictness, prudery, and a sense of duty. Values. Family was considered the core of society. The focus was on holy marriage, raising children, and domestic order. Work ethic. Diligence, self-discipline, and modesty were highly valued. Religion. Protestantism shaped ethics and society, while Catholic and Anglican currents also grew. Double standard. But the Victorian ideal was often full of contradictions. While decency and chastity were publicly preached, prostitution and double lives flourished in secret. Women were officially reduced to home and family. But it was precisely during this time that the first movements for education and the right to vote emerged. Child labor and social injustice stood in sharp contrast to the upheld moral ideals. These tensions made Victorian morality a multi-layered phenomenon, serious and formative, but also often ironically commented on and criticized. Education and science in everyday life. Education became increasingly important in the 19th century. Compulsory schooling was gradually introduced, whereby children from poorer families also learned to read and write. Libraries, museums, and public lectures made knowledge accessible. Science became popular. Many families read science books or newspapers together. This created a broader layer of educated citizens who could participate in culture and politics. Cultural pride and colonialism. The culture of the Victorian era was closely linked to the empire. Exotic goods, plants, animals, and works of art came to London from the colonies. Museums such as the British Museum or Kew Gardens collected and presented these treasures. The colonial gaze shaped art and literature, often with a mixture of admiration, exoticization, and a sense of superiority. Conclusion. Culture between glamour and contradiction. The cultural change of the Victorian era was enormous. Literature, art, and architecture flourished and reflected the tensions of the time. Moral concepts shaped society and everyday life, often strict, sometimes hypocritical, but always influential. Culture became a tool with which the empire presented its greatness and values. Queen Victoria herself was not an artist or thinker, but she embodied the values that defined culture and morality. In doing so, she became a symbolic figure of an era that continues to shape art and society today.
Chapter 9. The Death of Prince Albert. Mourning, Retreat, and Change of the Monarchy. The death of Prince Albert in December 1861 was a shock, not only for Queen Victoria personally, but for the entire British Empire. It marked a deep cut in her life and in the role of the monarchy. A radiant, self-confident queen became a woman in deep mourning, who withdrew from the public eye for many years. The sudden loss. Albert was just 42 years old when he died after a short illness. Officially, the diagnosis was typhoid fever, but modern historians suspect that he may have suffered from a chronic disease, such as stomach cancer or Crohn's disease. For Victoria, the loss was a personal disaster. She wrote in her diary, "My beloved Albert, my life, my everything is gone. I'm broken." The deep love that had connected them had become the foundation of their lives. Without him, Victoria felt lost. Victoria's grief. After Albert's death, Victoria fell into a decades-long period of mourning. She retired to her residences, notably Windsor Castle, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She wore only black clothes until her own death in 1901. She avoided public appearances, instead having her ministers represented. The people soon spoke of the invisible queen because she hardly appeared for years. Political consequences. Victoria's withdrawal had significant political consequences. The monarchy seemed weaker and less present. Criticism grew in the press. Some wondered why the queen was financed by the taxpayer if she did not show up. Republican currents became stronger. For the first time in a long time, the idea of abolishing the monarchy seemed plausible among parts of the population.
But despite all the criticism, Victoria's position remained untouched. Her reputation as a moral authority and her personal tragedy continued to make her respected. The role of the family. After Albert's death, Victoria was increasingly dependent on her children. Their eldest son, the future Edward VII, had a difficult relationship with his mother. Victoria considered him irresponsible and unsuitable to take on his father's role. Her daughters, especially Princess Alice and Princess Victoria, supported her, but also took on their own roles in European royal houses. The close bond with her children made Victoria the grandmother of Europe, but intra-family conflicts were inevitable. Friendship and scandals. John Brown. In her grief, Victoria developed a close relationship with a Scottish servant named John Brown, who accompanied her at Balmoral. Brown was direct, honest, and showed the Queen a blunt affection. He helped her regain her courage to face life and became one of her closest confidants. At court and in public, this friendship caused rumors. Some even spoke of a secret marriage. Whether it was a purely platonic relationship or more is still disputed today. But one thing is clear: Brown helped Victoria cope with everyday life without Albert. Symbol of mourning. Victoria's grief became an integral part of her identity and a symbol of the era. Her black clothes made her an icon of widowhood. At a time when many families suffered losses due to illness, she was seen as a woman who shared the same fate. Her personal pain made her more human and understandable for many subjects. Paradoxically, her grief helped to strengthen the bond between the monarchy and the people, even if she isolated herself for a long time. Slow return to the public. In the 1870s, Victoria slowly began to become more present again. Especially through the influence of Prime Minister Disraeli, she was persuaded to take on important public roles. In 1876, she was crowned Empress of India, a title that gave her pride and new energy. She again took part in parades, celebrations, and political rituals. But she remained a widowed queen until the end of her life, whose life was overshadowed by the loss of Albert. Change of the monarchy. Albert's death also led to a structural change in the monarchy. Less political power, Victoria was no longer as active in government business. More symbolic meaning, she embodied stability, constancy, and moral values. New role of the monarch, not as an active politician, but as a symbol of unity and continuity. In doing so, their grief indirectly contributed to shaping the modern representative monarchy as we know it today. Conclusion. Love becomes a legacy. The death of Prince Albert was the great break in Victoria's life. The self-confident queen became a widow who withdrew for decades. But it was precisely this loss that made her a symbol of loyalty, family, and stability. In her private life, she remained a woman who never forgot her lover. Politically, she changed from an active regent to a moral authority. For her people, she became the image of a queen who, like herself, endured suffering and loss. Albert's death thus became not only a personal drama, but also the starting point of a new chapter in the monarchy.
Chapter 10. The Later Years. Influence, Grandchildren, European Politics. The last decades of Queen Victoria's life were marked by a mixture of family ties, political influence in the background, and the growing role of Great Britain as a world power. Although she lived in deep mourning after Albert's death in 1861, she remained a central figure until her death in 1901, not only in Britain but throughout Europe. The Grandmother of Europe. Victoria had 9 children, whom she skillfully married off into the royal houses of Europe. This created a network of dynastic connections that earned her the title of Grandmother of Europe. Her eldest daughter, Victoria, married the German Crown Prince Frederick, later Emperor Frederick III. Their son was Wilhelm II, the last German emperor. Her son, Edward VII, later became King of Great Britain and Ireland. Her daughter Alice was the mother of the Russian Tsarina Alexandra, the wife of Nicholas II, making Victoria the grandmother of the last Russian Tsarina. Other children and grandchildren found their place in Spain, Denmark, Norway, Greece, and other royal houses. This dynastic network made Victoria a central figure in European politics, albeit with tragic consequences. Many of her grandchildren were on opposing sides in the First World War. Political influence in the background. Although the monarchy's power was increasingly limited in the 19th century, Victoria continued to exert influence, albeit more subtly. She wrote countless letters to her ministers in which she expressed her views. She was particularly involved in foreign policy issues, for example in relation to Germany, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. She supported Prime Minister Disraeli, especially in his imperial policy. Victoria saw herself as a moral authority who stood above the party political dispute. Although her formal power was limited, ministers could not ignore her personal weight. The empire in full bloom. In the later years of her reign, the British Empire reached the peak of its power. India was firmly integrated, and Victoria proudly bore the title Empress of India. In Africa, Great Britain massively expanded its influence, for example in South Africa, Egypt, and Sudan. Trade routes, colonies, and naval bases made Great Britain the dominant world power. For the people, Victoria became a symbol of this greatness, a queen who embodied stability and represented an empire where the sun never set. Public appearances and popularity. After years of withdrawal, Victoria began to appear more frequently in public again in the 1870s and 1880s. In 1877, she celebrated her 40th anniversary on the throne. In 1887, the Golden Jubilee, 50 years, and finally in 1897, the Diamond Jubilee, 60 years. These celebrations became national events that enormously strengthened their popularity. Millions of people cheered the Queen, not only in Britain, but in all parts of the empire. The Diamond Jubilee in 1897 in particular showed the climax of her veneration. Victoria was celebrated like a living legend, a symbol of the unity and greatness of the empire. Health and old age. In recent years, Victoria has increasingly suffered from health problems. She had rheumatic complaints and difficulty walking. She was small, corpulent, and often dependent on a wheelchair. Nevertheless, she remained mentally alert and continued to conduct extensive correspondence. Her sense of duty and perseverance impressed many. She remained active into old age. Relationship with Abdul Karim. A special role in her later years was played by Abdul Karim, an Indian servant whom Victoria met in 1887. Karim quickly became a close confidant and teacher, Munshi, who taught her Hindi and Urdu. He gave her insights into Indian culture, which further strengthened her affection for India. At court, however, his closeness to the Queen was highly controversial. Many nobles distrusted him and saw him as an unseemly upstart. Victoria defended Karim to the end, which shows how much she valued personal ties, even against resistance. Europe in transition. Victoria's later years coincided with a time of growing tensions in Europe. Germany had been united in 1871, a process that Victoria viewed with mixed feelings. Her grandson Wilhelm II was now German emperor, but she saw unpredictable traits in him. In Russia, discontent grew, which later led to the revolution, a fate that also affected her family. Although she had close family ties to many ruling houses, she was unable to prevent the conflicts between the nations. Conclusion: the Queen in the autumn of her life. Queen Victoria's last decades were marked by family network, which made her the grandmother of Europe; imperial splendor, which elevated her to the empress of a world empire; public veneration, which cemented her popularity; but also of personal grief and loneliness which she never quite overcame. Victoria was more than just a monarch in her old age. She was a symbol, an institution, a living monument.
Her life combined family, politics, and empire in a unique way.
Chapter 11. Victorian Everyday Life. Society, Women's Role, Classes. While Queen Victoria was at the head of the empire, and the empire was experiencing its greatest expansion, the lives of her subjects were marked by deep social contrasts. The 19th century brought prosperity and progress, but also poverty, child labor, and misery. Those who lived in Victorian Britain experienced their everyday lives very differently, depending on class, gender, and origin. The social pyramid. Society in the Victorian era was strictly hierarchical. 1. Aristocracy and nobility. Large landowners and nobles continued to hold great influence. Many sat in the House of Lords and determined politics and the economy. They lived on country estates, employed numerous servants, and maintained traditions. 2. Middle class. Merchants, industrialists, bankers, and professionals rose sharply in the 19th century. With interstellation, the middle class gained power and wealth. Education and respectability became central values. The ideal of the decent family emerged. 3. Working class. Factory workers, miners, maids, coachmen, and day laborers formed the majority. Their lives were hard. Long working hours, low wages, unsafe working conditions. Child labor was widespread, and only reforms gradually improved the situation. The class differences were visible in clothing, language, place of residence, and lifestyle. Women's role in the Victorian era. The role of women in the 19th century was strongly influenced by the Victorian ideal. The woman was considered the guardian of the house, responsible for morality, child-rearing, and domestic happiness. The home became the center of her life, while the man acted in public, politics, profession, business. Virtues such as modesty, purity, and fulfillment of duty were the guiding principle. But this ideal only reflected part of reality. Women of the upper class had servants and could devote themselves to art, music, and education, but without political participation. Working-class women often worked in factories or as maids, in addition to their role in the household. The women's movement gained momentum. Demands for access to universities, better working conditions, and finally the right to vote were raised. Pioneers such as Florence Nightingale, founder of modern nursing, or Josephine Butler, social reformer, broke taboos and opened new paths for women. Work and everyday life of the working class. Factory work. The life of the working class was closely linked to industrialization. Factories for textiles, steel, and machinery determined everyday life. Working hours of 12 to 16 hours were not uncommon. Children from the age of 6 or 7 worked in spinning mills or coal mines. Living conditions. The cities grew quickly. Slums emerged. Apartments were cramped, with no running water or sanitation. Diseases such as cholera, typhoid fever, or tuberculosis claimed many victims. Reforms such as the Public Health Act of 1848 slowly improved hygienic conditions, but the differences between rich and poor remained large. Leisure and fun. Despite hard work, a culture of leisure also developed in the Victorian era. Sport became popular. Football, cricket, and rugby were organized into clubs. Pubs were meeting places for workers, while the upper and middle classes preferred salons and clubs. Seaside resorts such as Brighton or Blackpool became popular destinations, especially by rail. Reading was a widespread pleasure. Newspapers, magazines, and novels, often published in sequels, reached millions. The growing culture of leisure showed that prosperity and industrialization also created new opportunities. Religion and morality in everyday life. Religion was ubiquitous in the Victorian era. Sundays were strictly observed rest days. Church attendance was a must for many families. Missionary movements spread, both in Britain and in the colonies. Religion supported the morals of the time, such as the emphasis on chastity, diligence, and subordination. At the same time, new currents emerged: free churches, social reforms, and a growing skepticism, due to scientific findings such as Darwin's theory of evolution.
Education and social mobility. Education became a central theme of the 19th century. From the 1870s onwards, compulsory schooling was introduced. Literacy increased sharply. Even children of the working class could now read and write. Libraries, lectures, and associations promoted learning for adults. Education was associated with the hope of social advancement, even if this remained difficult to achieve for the lower classes. Fashion and everyday life of the upper class. The upper class lived in a completely different world. Fashion was pompous and elaborate. Corsets, crinolines, and silk dresses for women. Suits, top hats, and pocket watches for men. Social events such as balls, operas, and dinners were central. The staff in large houses was numerous: butlers, maids, cooks, gardeners. For the upper class, the Victorian era was an era of glamour, while for many others, hard work and deprivation were paramount. Contradictions of Victorian everyday life. Everyday life in the Victorian era was marked by deep contrasts. Wealth and misery existed next door to each other in the expanding cities. Strict morality went hand in hand with secret double standards. Women's oppression stood alongside the rise of an active women's movement. Technical progress improved many things, but also brought new problems. These contrasts made society exciting but also conflictual, and they shaped the perception of the Victorian era to this day. Conclusion: a mirror of the era. Victorian everyday life was a microcosm of larger developments: industrialization, urbanization, social antagonisms, and moral values. While Queen Victoria was at the head of the empire, her subjects lived in a world of extremes, between luxury and misery, tradition and change, morality and reality. It is precisely this diversity that makes the Victorian era so fascinating. It was a time when the foundations of our modern society were laid.
Chapter 12. Death and Legacy. 1901 marks the end of an era. By the end of the 19th century, Queen Victoria had long since become a living legend. She had ruled for over 6 decades, longer than almost any other monarch before her. Her reign had transformed Great Britain from an agrarian country to the greatest world power. But every era comes to an end, and so the Victorian era ended with the death of its namesake in 1901. The last years. By the 1890s, Victoria's health was increasingly fragile. She suffered from rheumatism and had difficulty walking. Her eyesight deteriorated, and she also found it more difficult to hear. Nevertheless, she worked tirelessly until the end. She read and signed official documents every day. The last years of her life were marked by family conflicts, but also by pride in her numerous children and grandchildren. The Diamond Jubilee on the throne in 1897 had once again put her in the center of the world's attention, a triumph that confirmed her extraordinary position. The last days. In January 1901, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Victoria spent her last days at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, a residence she had loved with Prince Albert. Surrounded by children and grandchildren, she spent her last hours. She is said to have been quiet and collected, with the same dignity that had characterized her life. She died on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81. Her death marked the end not only of an extraordinary reign, but also of a century. The 19th century seemed to be finally over. National mourning. Victoria's death triggered a wave of grief that swept the entire empire. Millions of people took part in funeral processions and commemoration ceremonies. Newspapers around the world reported on the death of the Queen, who had been a symbol of stability and continuity for many. Her funeral was a state act of enormous proportions. Interestingly, Victoria herself had given precise instructions for her burial. She did not want to wear a black, gloomy funeral, but a white dress, as a symbol of purity and peace. Personal mementos were placed in her coffin: Albert's dressing gown and an effigy of John Brown, her faithful servant.
She was buried in Frogmore Mausoleum in Windsor next to Prince Albert, just as she had wished. End of an era. With Victoria's death, the Victorian era came to an end. Her son Edward VII ascended the throne and ushered in the Edwardian era. The new era was characterized by different values: more lightness, less strictness, cultural change. The 20th century was already on the horizon with all its challenges: imperialism, social reforms, international tensions. Many contemporaries felt that Victoria's death also meant saying goodbye to a world that would soon be irretrievably lost. The legacy of Victoria. Queen Victoria left behind a tremendous legacy. 1. The monarchy. It shaped the image of the modern constitutional monarchy. The monarch was now less a political actor and more a symbol of stability and continuity. 2. Family. As the Grand Mother of Europe, she connected the royal houses of the continent. Their descendants played a central role in European history in the 20th century. 3. Empire. Under her reign, the British Empire reached its greatest extent. Victoria herself became Empress of India, a symbol of Britain's global power. 4. Cultural heritage. Architecture, literature, fashion, and morality of the Victorian era still shape our image of the 19th century today. Conclusion: the farewell of a queen. Victoria was more than just a ruler. She was the face of an era that shaped Europe and the world. Her reign was full of contradictions: progress and misery, morality and hypocrisy, love and sorrow. Her death in 1901 marked the end of an era that bears her name. But her legacy lives on, in the institutions, in the culture, and in the memory of a woman who went from being a young princess to the most powerful symbolic figure of the 19th century.
Chapter 13. The Victorian Age in Review. Impact to date. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 not only marked the end of an exceptionally long reign, but also an era that is still considered formative for the modern world today. The Victorian era was more than just a period in British history. It was a time that shaped science, politics, culture, and society in ways that we still feel the aftermath. The monarchy in the modern understanding. One of Victoria's most important legacies is the transformation of the monarchy. Before her, British monarchs were often known for scandals or political power struggles. Under Victoria, the monarchy developed into a representative institution that stood above all for stability, continuity, and morality. This model became the basis for today's monarchy in Great Britain and also shaped other European royal houses. To this day, it is the image of the family monarchy that ties in with Victoria, a royal family that does not exist through political power, but through symbolic authority. Industrialization and society. The changes of the 19th century were so profound that the Victorian era can also be seen as the birth of modern society. Industrialization. Factories, railways, and new technologies created a world that was globally networked for the first time. Urban growth. London has become the largest metropolis in the world, a symbol of urbanization. Social reforms. Working time laws, child protection, and health protection arose as reactions to the hardships of industrialization. The problems and solutions of this period form the basis of many structures that we know today: public education, healthcare, social legislation. Science and culture. The Victorian era was a time of intellectual upheaval. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution radically changed the worldview and led to debates that continue to have an impact today. Advances in medicine, chemistry, and physics paved the way for the 20th century. In literature, Dickens, the Brontes, Hardy, and Wilde created works that are still read and address universal themes: justice, morality, love, freedom. The architecture and design of the 19th century also shapes cities to this day, from neo-Gothic Parliament buildings to Victorian terraced houses. Morals and values.
The word Victorian is often associated with strictness, prudery, and double standards. It describes a time when family, duty, and decency were upheld. At the same time, the age was marked by contrasts. While morality was preached, poverty, prostitution, and social injustice flourished. But in the long term, these moral debates led to societies dealing more intensively with issues such as equality, women's rights, and child welfare. The empire and its consequences. The British Empire was at the height of its power, but also a system that is still controversial today. On the positive side, global trade, infrastructure projects, railways, ports, and cultural interdependencies. Viewed negatively, colonial exploitation, oppression of local cultures, and the justification of imperial rule by racist ideologies. The Victorian Empire was both a source of British pride and the seeds of many conflicts that arose from the colonies in the 20th century. Women and society in transition. The Victorian ideal placed the woman in the house, but it was precisely at this time that women began to raise their voices. The first steps towards educational equality and employment have been taken. Organizations fought for women's suffrage, which became a reality in the early 20th century. Figures such as Florence Nightingale and Josephine Butler became role models. The women's movements of the 20th century build directly on the developments of the Victorian era. Global networking. Trade, colonies, and communication technologies such as the telegraph have brought the world closer together. Ideas, goods, and people moved faster than ever before. Migration and cultural exchange increased, both within the empire and beyond. Globalization as we know it today has its roots in the Victorian era. Symbolic significance of Victoria. Victoria herself remained a symbol beyond her death. For the British, it was the image of consistency in a time of constant change. For her family, she was the grandmother of Europe. For historians, it is a projection surface, strict, moral, but also human and vulnerable. The mixture of personal tragedy, Albert's death, and public greatness made her one of the most complex rulers of modern times. Conclusion: an age that lives on. The Victorian era was a time of extremes: wealth and poverty, progress and backwardness, morality and hypocrisy. But it was precisely these contrasts that made it an epoch that has decisively shaped the modern world. Without the industrialization and reforms of that time, our society today would hardly be imaginable. Without the cultural achievements, a central chapter of European literature and art would be missing. Without the transformation of the monarchy, today's British royal family would probably not be conceivable in its form. Queen Victoria herself is the symbolic figure at the center of it, a woman who balanced her life between private grief and public greatness, and thus became the namesake of an entire era.